All righty. Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to our last NATINA kōrero for this year. I'll get us going with the karakia and then introduce you to Karina. Really, really excited about having this kōrero today. Karakia timatanga, manakitia teine hui, manakitia teine ropu, manakitia teine whānau. Tainoa ki teine kaupapa. Arahina na kōrero, arahina na patai, arahina na ture nei kia puta ai te maramatanga. So bless this meeting, bless this group, bless this family as we come together, guide the discussion, guide the questions, guide the intent so that we move on to greater understanding. A very, very apt karakia for today, because I have been waiting for this for a while now, Karina, since I had the little initial, chat with you. Really, really grateful that you've taken the time to come along. I'll quickly introduce you and then hand it over to you to, introduce yourself and add to the introduction in whatever way you think fit. So we are really, really excited to have Karina Schreurs here. Karina is a trauma consultant with a strong background in therapy, in education, as well as neuroscience study. She's really, really passionate about bridging the gap between neuroscience and the classroom practice, the practical ins and outs of how do you actually implement trauma-informed approaches, and also offering educators those practical, accessible strategies that are manageable in the environment that they work in, help reduce stress for the child, for themselves, and creating those safe, supportive environments. And I think the other thing we talked about was, there's a lot of there's a need to not just do this work in the classroom space, but also home space. And it's so important, isn't it, that all the environments that the child is in are well supported. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. How do we support families? What do we do in that space? And yeah, we would love to hear all about you, Karina. First of all, who are you? Where are you from? What have you been doing? And then we'll get into the weeds of, the
Beautiful.
mahi that you do. On to
Lovely.
you. Welcome.
So kia ora koutou. I suppose I thought I might start by kind of sharing a little bit of my journey and a little bit, I suppose, of who I am in a way that can kind of help frame our conversation tonight. So I'm not going to give you the whole story, but I want to give you enough that it can kind of make some sense because often I think firstly, we all have a story and a journey that's valuable. And I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is actually that piece. So when you hear my story, I want you to go, wow, I also have a story because it's actually a story that, I always say to people, if you want to influence the brain, do it with story and do it with music. Like they would be two of the key pieces that we're doing. So I'm going to share a little bit of the story. Sometimes when I share my story, people go, wow, you've had the most fascinating life. And I would put that down in lots of ways to my neurodiversity. I have some ADHD. So I like novelty. I like change. I am fascinated by people. I am fascinated by the brain. I'm fascinated by culture. And that's kind of led me on my journey. So when I did my occupational therapy, so my background started in occupational therapy. Oliver Sacks stood out to me right from the very beginning. And there was a chapter in his book that we were reading in one of our papers about a man who mistook his wife for his hat. And he was trying to put his wife on his head. And I went, oh my gosh, I didn't even think that that would be possible. And that's going to be my life mission. When you have those aha moments of this is my life mission, I want to understand. So I would describe myself as a bit of a lifelong learner in this space. So I see myself as I like to learn and I like to stay really curious. So that's kind of where it started. And at the same time, I started in education way back and I can't even remember when I graduated. It must be 25 odd years ago. But I was working in education at that time, and I had friends whose children also had neurodiversity. And so I got to see firsthand that these kids have different needs. I think that we often see neurodiversity through a behavioral lens, but when you actually journey alongside your friends, you actually get to see a huge change developmentally, and you get to think about it differently. So, if you ever come to any of my presentations, I often say if we could have one shift in education and we moved from a real behavioral framework into a developmental and a relational framework, we would have a really different experience. And so when you journey alongside your friends, that's kind of what it looks like. It's a relational piece and it's a developmental piece. And so that kind of started, I suppose, my journey. And so then I was like, I've got to learn more. So all my postgrad papers were around sensory integration, around cognition, all things related to the brain that had my attention. So that's where it started. I worked in education for quite a while, worked in health, and then I told you I've got some ADHD. So I got a little bit bored, had two children, got married and had two children. And when they were 4 and 3, I made the great decision to ship us all off to Africa. So we moved to Africa, and I started working with the children with disabilities in Uganda and got to see firsthand the impact of trauma and the Lord's Resistance Army and all of that. So my kids were not in active war zones, but pretty close to that space. And I think if you didn't have ADHD, you just wouldn't be able to do that. Or maybe it was an age thing. I was still quite young. I was like 26. So I always go, maybe my brain wasn't developed enough to go, how safe are my kids actually in this space? So, they've sat with child soldiers that have killed people and been in active war zones, and it's been kind of part of my kids' world. So,
Yeah.
um, that's when I got to train with Bruce Perry. So he started his Child Trauma Academy. And he took 15 of us internationally on as his first cohort in the Child Trauma Academy. So I got to do that first piece of training with him. And I'm really thankful for that. It really helped shape my understanding of the brain and the impact of
Yeah.
experiences and all of that. And so that shaped me a huge amount. And at that stage, a lot of my work was Africa based. So he would send some of his professors from the Child Trauma Academy in America over to Uganda to help us. And yeah, it was a really beautiful period of time. And so that was, well, when did the Child Trauma Academy? Years ago. I'm not very good with dates. I told you I've got some ADHD. So that was kind of the journey for a long time. And so I sort of sat in the space of, I want to help others understand. If there's a mission in my world, I want to help parents, I want to help teachers, I want to help people understand experience. So if you sum me up in a sentence, that's what it would be about. And so that's what I did for quite a long time till I realized I feel like I've been told a lot of things, but have we actually seen those things? So that was my
Mhm.
motivation for going to do my applied neuroscience. I was like, I've been told this stuff and I've believed this, but actually, what do we see? What is it that we know? Where is the science piece up to? And I'm going to be honest, I cried through quite a lot of that study because I'm not a scientist. Academic writing and all of that is not my thing, but I got there, I finished that piece. And so they're kind of the main pieces that have framed it. And yeah, I think that understanding, helping people understand, whether that's a 4-year-old child, whether that's a 16-year-old student, whether that's a teacher, a teacher aide, a parent, or whoever, that would be, I suppose, my kind of mission. So that's kind of a little bit of my story.
Oh, that is absolutely amazing. I was very consciously trying to not say, oh my God, and wow. I was really zipping it so we could get all of that without me interrupting. But that is an amazing journey. And I just love the passion that you bring to it. And also, I love how you talk about not just one little space.
Mm.
For me as a mom, when I started, it was all about my children. Very soon I realized changing things for my children is really not gonna, work unless I work with others, unless I look at the different spaces. And like you said, it's not just the one little space, the education space, the communities matter, you know, families, children, us as,
Yeah.
professionals, all of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so I really love how you're looking at this through those different lenses and in those different spaces.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the things I think that I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think being an occupational therapist, having that understanding through that lens, and then applying the whole neuroscience and the practice of it in the practical sort of, spaces, I'm guessing that's a real advantage to you. And how in your head do you sort of see those two different, you know, um, areas of practice coming together? Because what now I'm not qualified. I've not done a whole lot of courses other than the free courses that I found online in the space of, becoming neuroscience and trauma informed, lots of stuff that I've managed to learn. And I think I'm like a bit like you, to be very honest, Karina. I've thought about it. Maybe I should study. Maybe I should study. And I'm like, I don't want to do all that paperwork and all that, academic stuff. And I'm like, no. And then I feel like, oh, maybe, at some point I might, but I'm like, I don't really want to do it.
Yeah.
So I understand, that as well. But there's so much out there.
Mm.
You have done the actual study. You have actually done the study from both those perspectives. Tell me a little about, what do each of those different perspectives bring, and how do you sort of, meld them? What's the advantage of it
Yeah,
for
I
you
think
in your sort of, professional life?
totally. This is how, like, if I think about the brain and I think about a billion neurons and I think about the communication piece, I think there's equally that many ways that we can understand and we can see and we can perceive and we can respond. So that would
Yeah.
be, if I'm thinking about if my brain's got over a billion neurons, it is likely that that's how vast this actually is. So that's often how I see it. And
Yeah.
when I'm working with people, I say this is a tiny piece of the puzzle. So like
Yeah.
I did not have time, I'm sorry, to do my hair or put on any makeup before this because I've just been training in a school and working with a student. But one of the things that I jotted down on my piece of paper were how many reactions the student had. So I spent 15 minutes with the student. So he'd be a year five student.
Yeah.
He had in that 15-minute slot, I had 60 marks on my piece of paper in 15 minutes. And it made me pause and go, wow, you imagine that much firing all the time that I have got no ability to pause, no ability to inhibit, no ability to plan, to organize, to think. Everything is this reactionary short circuit of the brain. And teachers are tearing their hair out because he's hurting people and he's telling them to F off. And I'm like, so if we understand impulsivity, that's actually what impulsivity plays out like. And so that's again my understanding piece. And so then they're like, so how do we fix that? I said, well, not telling him to sit still and be quiet and wait in all the ways that we often
Mm.
do. We do it by actually teaching a pause piece. And I said, here's the two times he paused when I watched him. He paused when he lay on his tummy and he paused when he had a computer screen in front of him. There's where he can pause. Now we need to explicitly bring those into another situation. And that's then how we actually use that piece. So I wouldn't say I give people a whole lesson in neuroscience. I have some stock standard things that I would relate to that I would
Yeah.
bring in. So in that situation with him, and that's on top because that's where I've just run from. Kind
Mm.
of had to speed a little bit to get back in time, but I'm here. So that would be an example. The other thing I often talk to is attention in the brain. And I spent some time this year with a cognitive neuroscientist who's been a researcher all her life. If you're interested in any of their names, Adele Diamond got some really amazing research. But I got to be a keynote at a conference with her over in Singapore this year, and hearing what her research is showing in terms of that ability to pause and to use inhibitory control, the ability to what would I say, hold different concepts in my head and make a plan. Like her research is showing that actually develops really young in typical development. So by the time a child's at school, they have some of these abilities.
Yeah.
But often, if I think about short circuiting in the brain, so I think about the impact of adversity, I think about inattention, I think about some of the ASD pieces that can play out, those developmental skills become so much more compromised. And then these kids become ostracized because we don't understand what we're seeing. And difference leads us to go, we need to do something about this. And so then you see that stigma and the separation that often plays out rather than an understanding point of view. So
Mhm.
attention, I often say, if my brain hasn't got something important to pay attention to, there's going to be a threat component. Our brains like to
Mhm.
have attention on something. And
Yeah.
again, is one of the things that you see play out, that there is this threat component that then leads me into the
Mhm.
short circuiting in the brain. I'm not thinking through, oh, you were a little bit mean to me, so let me do this to you. Doesn't
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
Like this boy that I watched today, he obviously has got some oral piece playing out. So he started licking his fingers to pick up paper and he passed it to his friend. And his friend said, "Ooh, gross, I don't want your piece of paper." And so what did he do again? He pushed repeat on the exact same thing. He licked the next piece of paper. So you see, my brain can't even process, it can't even take in that information that putting saliva on a piece of paper
Yeah.
is making this person have an emotion of disgust or, whatever language we want to use around it. And so I think our kids have so many unsuccessful situations play out day in and day out without the understanding piece to actually support that brain to have some sort of different response. So
Mm.
yeah, I don't know if there's probably lots of things that are kind of that play out for me, but definitely attention.
Yeah.
And for adults, the piece, like the more that I've read about, so when I trained with Bruce Perry, he would use the language that a little bit of stress that we recover from is good for us. Now, that research that he based that on was done on rats, and it's actually not true for human beings. So,
Wow.
every adult that I meet that's
Yeah.
experiencing stress, that's actually the worst enemy to our ability to use our executive function skills. And that's what you see play out in so many families. So, when families are like, what therapy do I need to go to? And like I had one she's had her child and seeing this therapist paying $200 a week, they're in so much debt, they don't know if they've got food. I'm like,
Mhm.
how about we push pause on that? How about we lower some stress? Because that's going to not only have an impact for you, it's also going to help your child because
Mhm.
that isn't necessarily what's needed in this moment. And I'm all for some therapy. I'm not against therapy, but it's around recognizing. So stress would be one of them.
Yeah.
It's really big. So I was in a school yesterday that the stress was just so high from every adult that
Mm.
I had conversation with, that I was like, if we don't change the stress component here,
Yeah.
I can tell you everything that I know, and none of that is going to register because your brain's not in a point to take it on. Your brain's not able to process it, to take it
Mhm.
on, to have awareness, to make change, to do all of those things. They only happen when stress isn't there. So, lots of the research is now showing even like a brain like mine that goes really quickly. I always say that about an ADHD brain. They're fast brains.
Yeah.
Stress isn't good for us. Likewise, a brain that really processes everything and takes in all the details, stress is equally not good for that brain. So
Mm.
there is no brain that stress is good for. And I
Mm.
think that if there's one thing I could change, I would change stress.
Um, that's really, really interesting, Karina, because tell me how this fits with the bit around learning happens outside the comfort zone. So are we saying that being outside the comfort zone can still happen without the stress? So you're obviously saying a little bit of that discomfort is okay,
Yeah.
but not stress.
Discomfort is not stress.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
So
so
stress,
tell me, unpack stress for me, because I'm thinking in my head, and this is again me without any of the neuroscience training, academic bits and pieces. But when we're talking about stress, are we talking about the actual hormonal changes that happen? The,
we're talking
um,
about the impact of cortisol
yeah.
on prefrontal cortex and how it
Okay.
takes away our executive function skills. So if
Okay.
we put the
Yeah.
science behind it,
Yeah.
cortisol
Yeah.
takes away executive function.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so absolutely, I can be a little bit out of my comfort zone. I can put a little challenge there. I can do all of that. That can actually lead to, if you've got the right practices in place, is what actually we grow and develop in.
Yeah.
That's not
Got
stress.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Tell me something. We've talked when we sort of touched base briefly, we talked about reward system. So when you're in stress, so I'm talking now about adults, about families, parents, teachers, educators, whoever is supporting the children, right? And when you want to motivate someone to take on new learning, take on new strategies, take on new habits, and when you're trying to support, and then you're also trying to take on this new learning, how can you really motivate yourself and the child to embed some of this stuff that hopefully will work?
Yeah.
Because I think like knowing is one thing, but practicing is another. And
Absolutely.
the practicing, especially in the moment of stress, is so different. Like all of this is fabulous. I'm sitting and chatting, and then somebody's having a meltdown, and I can handle a meltdown from one of my children. But then there's two, and then your partner's saying, you should be doing that and this, and then I go into like, I can't hold this all together the way I think I should
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
regulated state. So
Yeah.
what do you do? How do you start embedding some of it? What helps?
So I think one of the things that I came to learn in my neuroscience that I suppose is embedded for me now is our dopamine pathways don't just go up our brain, they go down our brain. So when I've got access to some of that executive function and some of that prefrontal cortex, I can have goals in mind. I can have a plan, and it's actually the dopaminergic neurons going down from the brain that actually lead to action. So motivation doesn't come from thinking. Motivation actually comes from action. So if I keep that in mind, then I'm thinking about the practice piece of what actually is that action. So anytime I'm explicitly teaching something, anytime I'm creating space for practice, anytime I'm practicing the ability to have some self-awareness. So I always say to kids, I'm like, guess what? There's no emotion remote control that somebody has, and they suddenly push an angry button and you get angry. Angry is your experience. And I think
Mhm.
that if we don't hold true to that piece, we'll never figure out our way through it because it's so easy. And I think when I've read, I think it's Dan Hughes, or I always get them
Yes.
muddled. Too many Dans. It's either Dan Hughes or I think it's Hughes, but it could be Dan Siegel. Says that he says shame plays out in three ways for young people. It plays out in altered truth. So if you're working with young people that have a tendency to have a different story than experience, sometimes that can have a shame component. He talks about minimization and he talks about blame. So they're kind of the
Mhm.
shields that if internally there isn't a value and a worth and that playing out for me, the blanket of shame plays out in terms of what those things can actually look like. So, like, I this boy that I and he's on top for me because that's where I've come from, but he something happened in the classroom and the teacher's like, I saw you do it. I didn't do it. And then you can F off now, like that's how much I'm not taking any ability to even hold the truth of that in that stage. So altered truth, I think, would be one of the big pieces that's really hard for us as adults, A, to understand and B, to respond to, because we know something different. And when we know something different, we want to help you know the truth as we perceive it.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that, I think in all of that, that's a really, what would I say? It's a really interesting space to consider how we support
Yeah.
what is truth and how do we do that piece.
Yeah. And that is so similar to the acceptance, isn't it? You're accepting
Yeah,
not just what they're feeling, but what they're
yeah,
saying in that moment.
yeah,
And yes, that is not your truth
yeah.
because you've seen them do it, but that is their truth in that moment
And I think
because
it's about how we move through emotion. Like I remember one night
yeah,
at my house, and I if you look, I you would see neurodiversity in my family. But I remember this one night, it's like, oh, I've got time. I'm going to cook the family this lovely meal. But in order to feel like I could relax, I wanted the washing folded before we had dinner. So I said to my husband, can you just finish stirring? Dinner's nearly ready, and then we'll all sit down and have dinner together. So anyway, he finishes stirring, and what's happened to me? I'm still folding the washing. And now he's dished up, and they're all sitting at the table eating dinner, and I am frustrated beyond belief. And it's one of those moments of going to be frustrated. There was actually something of importance that played out before frustration. And that's actually how I can mix that emotion. And as soon as I recognize, oh, this is frustration, that's because something's important. And I said to my kids, it was really important to me that we shared that moment together. And as soon as I said that, I had three helpers, two boys and a husband, all helping me with the washing. But if I hadn't have worked through that myself and gone, how rude, did they not realize I spent 3 hours cooking and
yeah,
I think we would have not got there very well. Or if my kids had pointed out, oh, mum, you're in. So we often talked about our brains. So,
yeah,
my kids would use language like, oh, you're in that brain state again, so that doesn't always help. Pointing out someone's experience to them very rarely leads them to where we want to go. And so that's why we've got to help people recognize their own experience. So when frustration comes to join me, what does that look like? Where do I notice that in my body? Is my heart beating faster? Has my temperature gone up? Am I clencing my muscles? So for me, my shoulders get really tight and I clench my jaw. That's how I know frustration's visiting me.
yeah,
But what happens, and this is where it falls over in the brain, that's the first thing. So when our body changes, it sends the message to our brain, and it's the brain that then tries to make the story of that experience. And so that story I just told you of, for goodness sake, I've got two boys and a husband, and they never do anything, and how useless, and it's always women that do everything. Like that
yeah,
could have absolutely been the story that my brain made up in that space.
yeah,
And that's one of the things that I help kids with is how can that story be a story of, oh, Mr. Frustration's come to visit me. That's because something's important. What's important? Because if I can shift my brain back there, that's
yeah,
what makes a difference. So I remember last year I had a 5-year-old and we were doing some things with rako sticks and she missed the point, where you tuck the sticks together. And so
yeah,
she threw her stick. And I was like, you must really want to be able to do this
yeah,
because that's what you've just told me in that moment. And she runs and picks up her stick and we carry on. So that would be an example of how I would support someone in a moment of frustration. But if I'd paused and said, that's not how we treat our sticks, that's not what we do, we
yeah,
would have really struggled to come back to that point. So,
yeah.
yeah.
So it is acknowledging the need for that person, that child, that individual to do something and to express themselves in a certain way, isn't it, at the end of the
Yeah, totally. To have the awareness of what is the experience that I'm having? What
Yeah,
is my body telling me? What is it that I'm noticing? All of
yeah,
that is one of the most helpful pieces.
yeah,
I think that can actually guide us.
yeah,
And when you think about it, for most of us, our body awareness started at a very, very young age from our experience being parented. You know, my mum
Mm.
would be like, go to the toilet, you're going on a long road trip, you know?
Yeah,
And if you didn't go, you soon learnt the hard lesson, didn't you? Of
yeah.
what it felt like to have a really full bladder because you hadn't actually listened to that. So we grow in our ability to notice in
Mm.
typical development. And I think it's a really important piece. So, yeah.
Um, I'm just thinking when when you're working with non-verbal, non-speaking, autistic children, it's so much harder for them to express the why or the what's happening and going on.
Yeah.
And what I've started realizing is sometimes just being able to hold the space
Hmm.
and acknowledging something that you don't even know or understand as okay, like, I see you, I hear you.
Yeah.
I don't understand you, but it's okay. Like,
I'm
I can
here.
just sense, yeah.
Yeah. I'm
And
here and I'm not too close. You know, I think that, but maybe not so much as a parent. A parent's different, but in an education setting, I say that to educators all the time. Communicate, I'm here.
yeah, yeah,
Close but not too close, you know.
yeah,
There
yeah,
is a dance to that, you know, like
yes.
I had a one who school said, well, you know, they're like, well, I think this child's selective mute, you know, severe autism playing out, et cetera, nonverbal in school, and things have absolutely fallen over. So they brought in a psychologist, they did a cognitive assessment which actually showed her cognition was okay. So when I'm working with kids with autism, that's my first question. What do we know about cognitive skill? And the principal, when I talked to her, said to me, "Oh, well, the problem was she was strapped into a chair, strapped into her pram, and that's why she could perform as well as she did." And I said to the principal, I said, regardless of the environmental supports or restraints we put in place, this is her cognitive score.
Yeah.
She is very, very bright in her own way. And
Mm.
so I said, and when I think about autism and the difficulties in communication, how are we supporting that piece? So I happen to have in my bag some chat boards. So I brought out a chat board and I showed her how to use it. And she used it for activities. She was able to communicate. She actually started verbally saying the words as the visuals were there to support her.
Mm.
And then on this chat board had other things. And so she pointed, she chose the activity of coloring. She drew the picture and then she pointed on this chat board of the sequence of communication. And I want to show someone. And then she took her picture, put it in her bag to take home to give to mum. You know, like it was a
Yeah.
really beautiful example of when
Mm.
I don't see the lack of expressive language and expressive oral language. Let me say that. When
Yes.
I don't see that as this child has got an intellectual disability and I
Mm.
actually support these kids, it's actually quite phenomenal what we could
Mhm.
actually see. So, you know, I think understanding those pieces, you know, and I suppose as a therapist, I've been lucky to work alongside speech language therapists and you know you get to in psychologists and so you see it all kind of come together in terms of what support and opportunity can actually look like. So
I think it's so important that we don't put limitations and we don't fill in the gaps too soon because when we do, we are coming at it from obviously our lens, our presumptions, our understanding. And so often we end up being wrong
mm,
and often, escalating things, making things worse, triggering our kids further. And I think as a parent, I've had to learn as my oldest has grown, even my second one, who does have some language and communicates in sort of, a multimodal way. I've had to really learn to slow down, stop thinking, and trying to predict what they're trying to say, give them the time, the space to fully sort of, express themselves and then make sense of it. Because yeah, I know I would often jump in really quickly and and then misinterpret what was happening. And then afterwards, I'd be like, oh, it was this, or oh, it was that, or, after
Yep.
there's a huge meltdown. So I think that's one big thing that I've learned. We've got
Yep.
to give them the time, the space to express themselves in whatever way they need
I was
to.
I was at a regional think tank or whatever you want to call it today over here in Australia, and the question was asked, what do you think the biggest obstacle is for everybody? And I said, it's our perception of time. Like that
Yeah,
is the exact piece that you're talking about there.
yeah,
So while everybody else has got this great intellectual thing, I'm like, it's our perception of time. Even in my role, if I sat with the complexity of my role and I let the bigness of that role influence me, I wouldn't have time to
yeah,
spend with that little 5-year-old or, that
yeah,
10-year-old
yeah,
or that mum or that whatever. Like, we're a team of 6 across over 50 schools in an area that we're driving 6 hours to. Like if you think about the complexity of that and you
yeah,
let that sit with you, you go,
yeah,
oh, I haven't got time.
yeah.
And, I think we miss so much from that framework. So I used to try and balance my life. I don't think balance exists. I think we live in rhythm. So my rhythm is, how do I give my full attention to this moment?
Yeah,
Whatever that moment is,
amazing.
that's my balance. And
Yeah,
I give my best attention when I have taken care of me. So,
yeah,
my non-negotiables is sleep, thinking around nutrition, thinking around movement. So, those for me are non-negotiables. So, even if you're in a crisis,
yeah,
those three non-negotiables,
yeah.
unless you are in my immediate family, I don't give those non-negotiables away. And I think that's also one of the really important pieces. And, when often teachers say, but I don't have time. And I'm like, so how much time would we spend randomly scrolling something? How much time would we spend in front of a TV? How much time
Yeah.
would we spend? We
Yeah.
do have time. It's our perception of it.
Um, Karina, we've often like, there's so much out there around sleep and nutrition, the importance of it. No one's debating it. The thing about movement, how important it is, it's only something that I've started realizing in the last sort of 2 years, and I'm just amazed and blown away
Hmm.
by how critical and important it is.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about why is movement so important? What is it that helps, what is it about movement that helps us sort of regulate? We know there's the rhythm, the repetition that helps. We know that component. But what is it about movement that is so essential to help us regulate
Mhm.
ourselves and shift
So,
from states? Yeah.
big question. And I'm going to start with the saying that I say when you're working with dysregulated young people, I
Yeah.
always think the body to move the mind. So often
Okay.
we want to think about the mind, and
Yeah.
then we think about moving our body. So I
Yeah.
have put those round the other way to be,
Yeah.
let's think body to
Yeah.
move the mind. So that example that I gave earlier around frustration, that
Yeah.
is a body experience. That is connected to a sensation that is occurring for me. And that's the power of the body. The body is almost the first space where experience happens. Now, I'm not saying that we've got a lot of understanding of that, but our
Yeah.
our cells, our muscles, our ligaments, our tendons, our
Yeah.
joints are constantly sending messages. And,
Yeah.
I think when we learn to pay attention to that piece, I think that's often where you see the biggest shifts in the brain. So, we could do a whole presentation on sensory processing and talk about,
Yeah.
our muscles and our joints and all the rest of it. But I suppose the simple piece is the more control that I have of my body. So here's what I learned from this neuroscientist. She said to me, the best indicator in a 3-year-old child of their ability to use their executive function is their balance skills.
Wow.
Mm. And that's what I'm
Amazing.
talking about.
You know, years ago, when my son was younger and I was trying out all the sorts of therapies that I can do to help him, there was somebody far away doing functional adaptive movement.
Uh-huh.
And I remember we still have somebody close by doing it here now. And I remember I used to drive about 50 minutes away
Yeah.
and take him every Sunday morning or something like that, because that was the only place we had somebody doing it. And one of the moms said, "Oh, it really works." And I was just a desperate mom at that point, so I had no clue why or what. But that kind of makes sense to me when you're talking about the more control you have, the balance, and the kind of stuff they used to do. I used to stand and watch, and I'm like, is this what I'm paying so much and driving so much, for? Is it really helpful? Is it really beneficial? So I never knew the sort of science behind it or anything, but
Yeah.
this makes so
And
much
I
sense.
I say to people all the time, a program doesn't change someone. So
No,
I
it
think
doesn't.
two
Yeah,
things change us, people change us, and
yeah,
experience changes us.
yeah,
And so I think it's less about a particular program
yeah,
and more about our experience and
yeah,
more about our people that
yeah,
actually is what changes us. So I
yeah,
think it's also changing up even I suppose our framework around it, like schools are like, what program do we need?
yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
like, and so like this teacher this afternoon, she had tears in her eyes when I said, you asked me a question, let me answer it with what I saw you do.
Yes.
Exactly is what I'm talking about. And you watch her go, oh my gosh, I've had this person in my space who's actually noticed what I
Mm,
am
yeah,
doing.
yeah,
Like that's a people bit that will
yeah.
stick with her way more than me giving her 50 strategies that she needs to bring into her classroom. And I
Yeah.
think that's the piece for me that I'm like, I don't think we hold the weight that we are our best selves because of relationship. We are our most developed self because of relationship, and we're also our most hurt self because of relationship. And it's the complexity of the
Yeah.
social component of who we are. So, I think that understanding of the social component is a really huge piece. So, I don't take it lightly when somebody invites me into their space. And
Yeah.
so, if you ever hear me say, and what you often find is people want to point out all the things that we're doing wrong and all the things that needs changing. But
Yeah.
how are we doing with actually reinforcing what is and
Yeah.
what is good and how do we see some of that? So that's a really important practice for me as well. Because if I can start there, now we've got space to
Mm,
add another piece into that,
yeah.
particularly
Yeah.
for teachers. So, yeah, I'm practicing that. So, lots of the schools here, when they're like, can you come and do some training for us? I'm like, can I come and see your kids first? And can I come and see you first? Because let's start there. I think we have a greater influence that way
Yeah.
than by providing. There's so much out there. My other issue, other than time, I talked about was accessibility. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, because accessibility is compromised in our world, we go to Google so many times. The amount of families and teachers, like I was in a school
Mhm.
yesterday where the school's like, yeah, the child's got autism and the child's got ADHD and ODD, and we've found all these resources. So I don't know where they found them. They look like screenshots off Facebook of, what that means and what you'll see. And I'm like, aren't you
Yeah.
just all overwhelmed by that? And we've put it up in the staff room on the
Yeah.
wall. I'm like, can we just take all that down? Like,
Yeah.
none of that is going to lead to change out there. And I think, yeah, it's how we do it. So it's not the what. And I said that today in this think tank. I said, it's not the what piece. There's a lot of what out there, but how we do it
Yeah.
is so vital. And I think when I know that there's time
Yeah.
and there is capacity,
Yeah.
then that's going to be a really good marker for how that can look.
Um, I love what you said about really helping people identify the good stuff they're already doing because we do stuff intuitively, isn't it? And like I think back over my journey of parenting and also working in, early childhood, working as early intervention specialist with our kids. And there's so much that I did. And then when I learned something, I was like, that's what I do anyways, or this is what I do is called, this
Yep,
is the term that goes
yep,
alongside the thing that I'm doing. So we do, and I think this is the other thing, isn't it? I feel that the reason why I could work intuitively well enough with the kids and sort of the teams that I worked with without learning or knowing anything was because of exactly what you said. I was making the effort to relate
yep,
and to connect.
yep.
And I was really working hard at doing that. And I remember going through a phase with my own children where I didn't do that
Mm,
because I was relying on professionals to give me answers
mm.
or relying on, learning something out there and then getting it in and then really struggling and failing at it.
Yeah,
And, it took me a while to like fail, go through the meltdowns, everything falling apart,
yeah,
and then going, damn it, I'm just going to cut back on everything.
yeah, yeah,
I'm going to stop trying to learn and do stuff,
yeah,
and I'm just going to be.
yeah,
I'm just going to, go through this together,
yeah.
and that shift happens. So I think the being part is so important because
And
I
it's good enough, like that sense of this is good enough, it's not perfect, it's not
yes,
free of mess, it's not, as structured and familiar and consistent as we'd like it to be. It's good
yeah,
enough.
yeah,
It's that ability to be able to acknowledge what is, but also sit with because as soon as there's a sense of, but there's so much more, and I could be, and it drives a pressure and
yeah,
stress piece,
yeah.
which actually is one of the biggest detrimental things for us. So, mm,
And I think, like, for us as adults supporting our kids, it's so important to be aware of where the pressure is coming for us. Because
yeah,
often, I remember talking to parents who would go like, but when I'm outside, I have to do this and I have to. And I'm like, no, you don't have to. Like, just sit and,
yeah,
hold that space like you do at home when,
yeah,
your child is having a meltdown and stuff. And I've had to do that
yeah.
sometimes,
I
where I'm
I
like, I'm not
remember.
going to let people pressure me. I'm not going to let the looks or whatever else it is pressure me into, I have to control my child. I'm going to let him feel it through. I'm just going to keep him safe, everybody safe, us safe, and then sort of go through that
Yeah,
that together.
yeah,
And I think it's Peter Levine who says, when you don't have any witness, when you're going through a traumatic incident and you don't have anyone witnessing it with
yeah,
you and you don't have anyone to share it with,
yeah,
that's when it sort of stays and you have a lot of those negative effects of trauma.
yeah,
And I also think that is probably one of the reasons why that trauma bonding happens. People with
yeah,
similar trauma and stories
yeah.
come together and
They
and
find
want to
each other.
connect. Yeah,
Yeah,
you know.
totally, totally. And I
Um,
think I think Gabor Mate says it as well. He says it's not what's happened to us, it's being alone in what's happened to us. And
true.
if I am in a pressured situation, one of the things, like I had a parent who was in such a state of distress, I actually made her a behavior support badge. And she's like, "What's this for?" I said, "Because when you go out there, I want you to put this on. I want
Yeah,
you in this moment to tell the world, I am a behavior specialist and I do not need your opinions or your ideas." And there is something about role that actually holds us in uncertainty more than lots of other things. So I use
yeah,
roles all the time with kids, but with
yeah,
that particular mum, she laughed at me. And she did use it. She said there was days I used that behavior specialist badge, Karina, and I was like, yeah, and I gave it to you because you know what? There's days that it's okay to use that
yeah,
I can put on a badge,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
often tell the story. I was a behavior specialist. I had my badge on, and I had this beautiful kid with autism who was way faster than me that managed to, we'd been on an outing and he managed to run into McDonald's. He got in behind the counter and he started pouring his own Coke. So I often share some of these stories because I think people go, oh, that would never happen to a therapist. That would never
Yeah.
happen to somebody who's in that role, like they're meant to be
Yeah.
on top of it all. Well, if we're actually in those same situations, it does happen. And I
Yeah.
think parents don't hear enough of that. I often tell parents, somebody told me that I needed to read Super Nanny when I was in my parent role because my child was having a meltdown in the toy shop because he wanted a toy. I'm like, just so that you know, I said, A, that comment's not helpful, and please don't ever say that to anybody else. And I said, if it wasn't for the rest of the world, I wouldn't have even replied to you. But for everybody else's sake, I'm going to ask you to keep your opinions to yourself.
Yeah.
Like you can say what you like to me as a parent, like that's not
Mm.
going to have that level of influence. But I was just like, you go like if that's a child that had autism
Yeah.
and you're a parent who's not feeling empowered
Yeah.
and somebody telling you, well, you just need to watch Super Nanny in a meltdown. And this is the
Wow.
other thing I learned. I think this is a helpful piece that helped my journey a lot. We judge to the degree that we're willing to be involved. And I learned this the hard way. So we fostered a child for a while, and he had experienced methamphetamine in utero. There was a big trauma piece playing out, and he came home one day and he's a little bit distressed, and he said to me, "I have to make a volcano." And I'm like, "Volcanoes? I love volcanoes." So we made the best volcano you have ever seen, but we made a mess. And so there's like paper mache glue probably on the windows, and it's not a paper
Yeah.
mache is not a mess-free thing. And my husband walks in and he's like, "Oh, what's this mess? Clean it up." And I'm like, "Go and have a shower. Like, you just can't even be part of this." So, no, that was day one. The next day, I look out the window and here's my husband with this kid letting him use a skill saw. And
Yeah.
I go into, what the heck? And I realize in both of those moments, neither one of us paused enough to understand before we opened our mouth. Because if my husband had heard that story of going, I don't even know if I can make a volcano, and nobody's ever helped me make a volcano, etc., he would never have seen a mess. He would have seen an opportunity. And likewise, if I'd paused to understand my husband's piece around that skill saw, I
Yeah.
would never have said that he put that child at risk. And I think
Yeah.
that's the piece,
Sure.
that ability to pause and become involved, to understand,
Yeah.
is number one that we
Yeah.
see change in. So
You
anyway, that's
know,
my funny stories.
it is so interesting because when I work with parents of autistic tamariki and especially when they're in that, new stage of just trying to understand their child, understand autism, and they talk about some of the negative stuff, and I actually celebrate it and I say, that's so exciting. Like, this is fabulous. And they find it puzzling because they're like, is this a good thing? It could be something as simple as going and grabbing something off, another child or another person. And I'm like, that is so cool because they've never done it. They've never had the confidence to do it. They've
Mm.
stood and they've looked. If somebody's taken something away from them, they've not grabbed it back. They've not stood up for themselves. They haven't always had that. And so some of our children are still learning. And that stage is important, isn't it? So when they're at that stage, you really celebrate that and you
Yep,
go, oh my gosh, this is fabulous learning.
yep,
This is, the next step.
totally,
And then,
totally.
of course, if they're doing it all the time, and then you're going, okay, now how are we going to actually look at it in a different way? And we're going to, shift this behavior into something of sharing, into something of, more of the positive interactions with other kids. So I think the stage at which our kids are, the developmental stage, the context is so important. And you're right, people come in from the outside and judge. And so it's so important, isn't it, for us as adults who are supporting our kids
Yeah,
to be mindful that we probably know the context better.
yeah,
We know and understand the child better. We understand their journey better.
yeah, yeah.
And it's so important that we don't take things to heart and we don't get carried away by that external
Totally.
picture that you feel
Yeah.
to behave in a certain way or
And
respond in
the
a certain way.
reality is, same is actually kind of boring. Like like I was in a school the other day and they're like, that child just won't write with a pencil. So I said, well, what will he write with? And they're like marker pens. So over here in Australia, they call them texters, right?
Yeah,
they don't have marker pens, they don't have felt tip tips, they call them
yeah,
texters. And I was like, so he writes with texters. How cool is that? And they're
yeah,
like, well, no, he's meant to be writing with a pen. I said, who says? And I said, not only now is he writing with his texters, he has to write in every color. So he's getting like, he's got 15 colors. He's
yeah.
practicing 15 times more than every other kid. And so now it started this competition in this class
Amazing.
about how much we can actually do because this
Yeah,
kid with autism writes everything 15 times because he
yeah,
has to
yeah,
write it in every color. And I'm like, why did we think that was going to be a problem? Why did we
yeah,
think he had to write with a pen? Like,
yeah,
who decided that piece? And I think that's it for me. That if I just sit with, that's often my what if I can start with not what someone's not doing, what is
yeah,
it they are doing, and I build on that. I think I
yeah.
get to see by far the biggest change. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And the creativity and thinking outside the box is something that's so crucial, isn't it? When we're
totally. And I think the
working, supporting.
confidence,
Yeah.
like often schools say to me, oh, it feels so
Mm.
nice that somebody's actually saying it's okay that they write with marker pens.
Yeah.
And particularly as an OT, because
Yeah.
that's our thing. We look at tripod grips, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
lots of teachers use that sort of language. And I'm like, it's kind of sad. And I say that to families all the time. Don't let people take intuition from you. Like let that stay true for you because
Yeah.
your understanding and your knowing in a situation is going to be far greater than mine will ever be. And I think that if we as a collective community could grow in that space and how we
Yeah.
communicate, like we were talking in this think tank of saying at our first parent teacher interview, if teachers could say nothing other than ask questions to learn about who this child is,
Yeah.
that would be a good start. Like I don't have to know everything. I don't have to be the one that's got all the answers. I am part of a collective space. And, so that's one of the things we're implementing over here, that first teacher interview. Here's the 5 questions that I want you to ask of your families to understand who this child is as a
Yeah.
starting point rather than jumping in, well, they're at this reading level and they're at this writing level, et cetera,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that space is a really important space. So
Amazing.
mm.
Look, I know we've sort of come to the end of our time, but there is still one more burning question. Tell me a bit about recovery from distress. What do you think, given everything that you know, what do you think recovery from a distressing episode, incident, event, should look like? Is there, recipe? Of course, it's going to be different based on individual context and stuff, but is there sort of a framework that you think should be used? Is there something that's worked really well in your experience,
So are we
around
talking
that
for
recovery?
children? Are we talking for adults? Are we talking collectively?
We're talking for both the
Okay.
child
Yeah.
and the adult supporting the child because it's really important. We can't work with the child if the adult doesn't have, the
Yeah.
supports as well,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
I'm really curious. For me, I've just faffed around, over the years, and I've kind of learned, for me, obviously, in the moment, that the regulation is important and breathing doesn't always work. Sometimes it works really
Yeah.
well. But then I also do things. Actually, I've learned this from my son who rocks and things, and I realized that the rocking with him actually just to
Yeah.
support
Yeah.
him and to imitate
Yeah.
him and be there for him. Actually, I realized, oh my gosh, this helps me. So
Yeah.
I started doing some of that. I've started
Yeah.
some of the squeezing and,
Nice.
just feeling
Yeah.
my body,
Yeah. Yeah.
to sort of ground myself.
Yeah.
Visualization never works for me. I've
Yeah.
tried that. It
Yeah.
just doesn't work.
Yeah. I can visualize when
Yeah.
I'm regulated. That's what I
Yes.
know about visualization. It works beautifully when I'm calm and I'm imagining lying on a beach and
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
that. That doesn't work for
Yeah.
me at other times.
Yeah.
So I always say to adults, you need your emergency self-care plan. So
Okay.
when I am distressed, what is my go-to in terms of my self-care plan? So I practice it, and mine is I fold
Okay.
my arms. And I've
Okay.
taught myself, if we're having a conversation and I do not even understand what the question is, nor have a grid what to
Yeah.
say, I have lost track of my whole being. This is what I automatically do. I fold my
Okay.
arms and I would
Cool.
give myself a hug. But I've taught
Okay.
myself that. So
Yeah.
even when I'm working with really tricky kids and, we're in really high spaces of escalation, first
Yeah.
I take care of me
Yeah.
unless safety's compromised. And
Yeah.
so, if I've got a kid running down the road, I'm not going to be folding my arms,
Yeah. Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
put that in context. But if safety is okay, if we are safe enough in this moment, I
Yeah.
will take care of me before anything else,
Yeah.
particularly if something has created a shock, something that's sitting tricky for me. I
Yeah.
will take care of me because if I'm not regulated, I'm no use to anybody. So that
Yeah.
would be my first thing. Every adult needs something that works for them.
Yeah.
Breathing doesn't work for me until I've
Yeah.
folded my arms because I
Yeah.
actually have a trauma memory related to a near drowning. And when you
Yeah.
think about that, the sensation of that is, A, you can't breathe.
Yes.
And so, that is not a comfortable place for me. So it takes a while to find my breath in
Yeah.
moments of distress. So
Yeah.
that's why doing something with my body, folding my
Yeah.
arms, definitely works. And I think so, knowing you and knowing what works for you. The muscles definitely would be part of it for me. So, if I folded my arms, that's why, people always laugh at me. Like I was in the school last year and this kid was jumping up and down on a thing. And I just got out my hand cream and I started giving myself a hand massage. And everyone's laughing at me, but I'm like, that's the sort of stuff that I'll do. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
like I wasn't distressed in that moment. So I didn't need to give myself a hug, but
Yeah.
I will do that. Or, often I have rings on. Sometimes I'll
Yeah.
do that. So I had another young one that was having a moment maybe a month ago now, and I said, when I have some tricky moments, I spin my ring. Would you like a turn with my ring? So, it's the
Yeah.
same thing. I'm still doing this push, pull.
Yeah.
I'm engaging the joints, I'm engaging the muscles, and I'm thinking that pattern, rhythm, repetition. So we can model that
Mhm.
really, really beautifully. But
Yeah.
often when kids are dysregulated, we add more dysregulation by telling them what to do, by
Yeah.
standing over them, by our tone of voice,
Yeah.
by even using words. So very rarely, like that would be how we'd model it. So that young
Yeah.
person I told you about with the ring, I didn't start there.
Yeah.
I happened to be walking past and she just told her teacher to F off and it was all in a big thing. And I'm like,
Yeah.
a strange flower. So I made a big exaggerated thing, and there was a strange flower in the garden, and I didn't get a lot of eye contact or connection from her at that stage. So then I said to her, I said, I talk funny, don't I? So I used the fact that I'm from New Zealand. I'm now living in Australia. And she then looked at me and she's like, mm-hmm. And then I said, could I come over there where you are? And so she let me come. And that's when I told her about the ring. So that would be an example of like when someone's escalated, I
Yeah.
want their attention onto something. That would be
Yeah.
my primary goal. So that's why I tried to make it about the flower. Didn't get engagement. Now I've made it about my funny way of talking.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm trying to shift her attention onto something or
Yeah.
someone. That would be my primary goal. When I've got attention, so if attention, I think I said earlier, if attention's not on importance, it's going to be on threat. And that's what was driving lots of what was playing out for us. So that for me, when I'm working in de-escalation, would be number one. So I think about all the young people over the years, like there was a spider in a classroom I used once. There was things in the space that I've used. I'll use
Yeah.
whatever, but I use some exaggerated narrative to
Yeah.
support that attention coming onto without emotion. So I'm not distressed in that moment. If I'm
Yeah.
distressed, I need to first regulate myself. If I'm
Yeah.
regulated, now I can use what's around me to shift their attention
Yeah.
into something shared together.
Yeah.
And then from there, I use acknowledgement. I think when emotion is present, it needs some acknowledgement. So I use things like
Mm.
tricky moments, but it's a moment. Let's be
Yeah.
honest, we all have moments. How do we shift
Yeah.
through that space? So, yeah, we could probably talk about that for a whole hour in itself, but that would be kind of what I
Yeah.
would be thinking. But first, attention on ourselves. If we are not regulated, please
Yeah.
pause. Like let's do that piece well first.
Yes, yes. I love what you said. For me, I've realized for my second son especially the shifting attention and using humor often works.
Yep.
But it only works for him.
Yep.
And what I've realized is so I've got three kids, and I can't use the same strategy, obviously, with any of them. And so with my youngest, to be very honest, that distraction doesn't work.
Yeah.
The acknowledgement works.
Yeah.
Really acknowledging how he's feeling,
Yeah.
what state he's in without
No.
judgment, without me adding the
Yeah.
emotion to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I'm just realizing with
Oh,
my oldest son, it is actually just acknowledging by being there because he doesn't speak, he
yeah.
doesn't,
Yeah.
verbally communicate. But he's the kind of child who used to, back in the day when I was told by psychologists when he was younger that you ignore the behavior, you walk away. And no kidding, I would walk away and he'd run behind me, scream in my face, and
Yeah.
put his face in front of me, like, look at me, I'm so mad and angry.
Yeah.
And I learned that again intuitively that that's what he was trying to say.
Yeah.
So I love what you said. So the shifting attention is obviously similar to grounding, isn't it? You're grounding, helping them ground by shifting their attention. Is that
Yeah.
right? So that's
Yeah.
sort of a grounding
Yeah, I
strategy.
think, from an OT, we often talk about grounding through the feet and becoming present. It could
Mhm.
be anything. So if grounding is I'm grounding my eyes, I'm grounding my ears, I'm grounding my body, I'm
Yes.
grounding,
Yeah.
if that's
Yeah.
how I understand grounding,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
absolutely. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. It's that sense of what has my attention.
Yeah.
And, it's a question that I often will ask kids. I wonder where our attention is.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to do that when they're dysregulated, but we need to have better conversations around attention. It's
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
one of the biggest things out there that's playing out for kids. They actually don't know how to do that piece.
That's very interesting because that's something I never knew. So that's a huge takeaway for me that, if you are not focusing your attention on something important, then you are likely to feel threatened and unsafe.
So when my
Um,
brain, so if my brain, so that's the two pathways. So attention has threat or importance. But what happens is
yeah.
when my mind's not on a task, I mind wander. So if it's a threat-based attention pathway, I
Yeah.
go back to everything negative and I future predict negativity. And that's
Ah,
why lots of kids have such an avoidant piece playing out,
yeah,
particularly connected to
yeah,
learning.
yeah, yeah.
So that's why,
Got it.
yeah, and I think
Okay.
that's their default mode. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
thinking through what that plays out like. So when threat has played out, like I remember a girl saying, "I was like, what would it be like to go home and make your nan a cup of tea?" And she's like, "Well, she'll probably throw it back in my face because how do I even know she's thirsty?" That
yeah,
would be an example of a threat-based attention piece
yeah,
that's now future predicting. And so if you talk to this nan, she said that kid does absolutely nothing.
yeah,
Well, how could she? If I
yeah,
even made you a cup of tea, you're going to throw it back in my face. Why am I going to do that? So,
yeah.
I think that's all part of that piece. So, yeah.
Amazing.
Mm.
That is so fascinating. So, would you say then the opposite is also true? Linda's put a comment about task positive network versus default mode network. So, I'm
Yep.
just wondering, so if your brain is wired, because of the trauma, because of the negative experiences, into, sort of everything's doomsday and focused on negative, then that's where you'll wander if you're not focused on something or attending to something,
Totally.
specific.
And when I'm doing
But
a
but
task, when
I'm
I'm doing
just
it, oh,
yeah.
sorry.
No,
when
you
I'm
go ahead.
doing a task and my body's involved with that task, I'm in
Yeah.
that task space. You know, it looks
Got
really
it.
different.
Yeah.
And I think that's why even I'm having lots of conversations in schools about how we're using the idea of brain breaks. You know,
Yeah.
are we giving the right messages connected to learning? If
So
we need a
fascinating.
break from all of that, you know,
Yeah.
what even are we having a break from? And
Yeah.
I think there's so many conversations around all of that. So I don't necessarily have answers. I think I sit in a really curious space with lots of, I'm wondering if I'm noticing experiences and I'm starting to kind of try and map out
Yeah.
and help others understand experience, I suppose would be kind of my piece of that puzzle. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that have pieces of that puzzle, and I think
Yeah.
that yeah, I think we all hold a piece of that. You know, if you talk to social neuroscientists, they'll bring in a whole lot more related to relationship and
Yeah.
attachment and all that. If you talk to psychologists, they'll have a whole lot more around cognition and all that. You
Yeah.
know, tonight you're talking to an occupational therapist who's very function driven. So
Yeah.
often we'll say the same things and use different language or different ways of
Yeah.
explaining it, but it actually is the same message. So yeah.
That's very interesting. You know what came to my mind because I was trying to make sense of, what he was saying. And what came to my mind was that saying, an empty mind is the devil's workshop. And I was just thinking, there's obviously some, neuroscience behind that sort of a saying.
Yeah.
But tell me something, is the alternative also true then that if you are positively wired, and if you are wired towards, creating and looking at things positively, looking at things as an opportunity, because you know how you have people who have a positive mindset and people who have a negative mindset, optimists and pessimists. Does that mean that if you are not focused on something, you're going to wander into some of the more creative and positive, imaginative spaces?
Yeah, I
Is
think,
that true as well? I'm just curious, that's all.
yeah, I don't know if I can answer that question. Other people might have an answer to that. I think intentionality is one of the most important things that holds our minds. So, like, I
Yeah.
think, you know, when I finish training, so, you know, this is a chat, so this is different, but, you know, I've just come from a school and I've been training. You know, 15 years ago, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I said that and I wished I'd said that and all that. But actually that's vulnerability. You know, like that's not
Yeah.
actually processed. So it's that intentional practice of what is the piece that I want to take out of that? And if I
Mhm.
didn't say that, is that something that's really important? So next time I train, is that where I want to start from? You know, it's the fact that our mind can just wander and like I remember somebody I spoke to once said we literally live 15 minutes away from doom in some ways. Like if we let
Yeah,
our minds wander in that negative
yeah,
space, it doesn't take too long till we don't feel that great. And I
yeah,
think it's one of the pieces, yeah. There's
yeah,
lots of pieces,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I
yeah,
suppose the part of the brain that's fascinated me looking at some of the brain science connected to trauma is the part of the brain where empathy and self reflection kind of sits. And often post trauma, that piece actually becomes like there's more activity in that part. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
suppose what that makes me wonder is if I spend, say, 2 hours of all my day looking in myself at all what's wrong and what needs fixing and what I need to change,
yeah,
I'm actually paralyzed in lots of ways for
yeah,
action and activity. And so,
yeah,
you know, I said earlier, the research is really clear now that motivation doesn't come from anywhere but action. And
yeah,
so, how am I? So that's where our routines are really important. And
yeah,
uh, yeah, our routines, our rituals, our ways, you know, all of that sits in terms of our motivation.
yeah.
Yeah.
That is really, really fascinating. Gosh, Karina, this has been such a interesting conversation. I would love to like carry on, and I know we could go on forever. But I do need to like
No, it's
bring it
like
to an
time.
end. Hopefully we have you again another time. Now my mind is buzzing with so many things. I'm just thinking of, oh, what about this and what about that? But look, thank you for coming. Before we close, I will close us with a karakia soon. Before we close, tell us a little about what you're doing. So I know you've got a practice. What do you do? How do people contact you? I know you've got a website, so I'll put that
Yep.
in the
Yep.
chat. But
So
yeah.
I moved over to Australia because I've been working in a private space for probably the last 15 odd years, and I wanted to experiment with taking what I believe is good practice
Yeah.
into more of a government educational piece. And so I'm working with the Department of Education in Victoria looking at that piece, but I don't want to ever, and I said to them, I said I need to have variety. So if this role doesn't involve being in classrooms with kids supporting
Yeah.
teachers, it's a no from me.
Yeah.
So I very much am, navigating that. So I don't do, I'm in a point eight role doing that piece. So I'm doing a lot of support for educators, a lot of support for kids across schools within the Department of Education. So I'm there. And then I do run our business back in New Zealand. So I do come back. I was back in New Zealand. I think I've been back 3 times this year for different events and things
Yeah.
happening. But yeah, my favorite place is sitting with, a company in school and supporting their learning and their development and all the rest of it. So we do have online courses that people can purchase if they're interested. You can see those on our website. But yeah, I think I've tried to do that piece relationally because everyone's like, well, how come we'd never heard of you? Like, when you and I met, we'd heard about each other for how long? But
I
I'm not very good
know.
at that whole networking, and the business piece doesn't even really interest me. It's more about the people piece. So,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
that's a little bit of me and where I'm up to.
It's so funny, but with Natina, before we started and when we just started, in my head, I was just really thinking exactly what you were saying, how am I going to connect and what am I going to do? All of that, like, what do I need to do as a organization? And I failed miserably because I'm not into, business or anything like that. But I realized it's the connections with people, having all these conversations, that is what grows, that is what helps us connect, pass on the information and make sure things are moving, isn't it?
Yeah,
I've given up trying to learn all of that kind of stuff. I'm like, I'll just keep doing what I do and,
yeah,
connect with people and keep things going that way. So it's
yeah,
been so fabulous having you. Thank you
yeah.
so much. We've got so many new little nuggets of gold that we've learned today. And I'm really excited. You've given me so much to put content out in terms of just sharing the information. So really do appreciate it. And I do hope we see you again. And if you're down here in New Zealand again, in Auckland, please do let me know. I would love to catch up with you in person as well.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I know we do need to meet in real life. We can't
Yes,
leave it
yes.
online.
That'll be so cool, honestly. For everybody listening, this is the last kōrero for this year. We will be back again in February next year, and we've got all the recordings of kōreros on the website. So if you've missed others, you can always catch up. And I will close us with a karakia, and hopefully everybody, all our listeners, our community have a lovely, end of year break when it, gets here, which is pretty soon now. So thank you. Kia ora, and we will see you at the next kōrero. All right. Karakia whakamutunga. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai. Kia turuki whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. All right.